Evelyn Carter slammed her loaf down on that wooden table so hard the tin cups rattled, and every woman in that hall turned to stare. Her hands were shaking. Her jaw was set. She was done apologizing for what she carried. She was done shrinking. If they wanted to laugh, then let them laugh, but she was not walking out that door without being seen first. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me all the way to the end. You will not regret it. The bread had been wrapped in her mother's cloth since 4 o'clock that morning. Evelyn Carter had not slept. She had not even tried. She sat in the dark kitchen of her small farmhouse at the edge of Willow Creek Valley and listened to the sourdough starter bubble in its clay jar, like something alive, like something that remembered what she remembered, and she fed it flour and water the way her mother had taught her, measuring by feel, because the old tin measuring cup had a dent in the bottom that threw off every number. She had made this bread 100 times, maybe more. She made it when she was lonely, which was most days. She made it when the cold came through the gaps in the walls, and the fire wasn't enough. She made it when she missed her mother so much that her chest felt hollowed out, like something had come along and scooped out everything soft and left only the hard edges behind. She would mix the dough and press her knuckles into it and breathe, and for a little while the ache would quiet down enough that she could function. That morning she made it for the Willow Creek Harvest Festival baking contest. She knew what she was walking into. She was not stupid. She was not naive. She had lived in this town for 6 years, and in 6 years she had learned exactly what Willow Creek thought of a woman like her, a large woman, a plain woman, a woman without a husband or a family name that meant anything, a woman who kept to herself on a property that sat too far from the main road for anyone to bother visiting. She had learned it in the small ways first. The way the dry goods clerk always seemed to find something to look at on the shelf behind her head when she asked a question. The way the church ladies thanked everyone else by name after the Sunday potluck, but called her the Carter woman. Among themselves, voices low, like her name was something borrowed that didn't quite fit. The way Margaret Whitmore had once looked at her in the mercantile, and then looked away again so quickly it was almost like she hadn't looked at all, like Evelyn was a piece of furniture that had ended up in the wrong room. But Evelyn was still going to that festival, because this bread was not hers. Not entirely. It belonged to someone who deserved to be remembered in a room full of people, and Evelyn was going to carry it in there if she had to carry it through fire. Her mother, Ruth Carter, had kept the sourdough starter alive for 31 years. She had carried it from Missouri in a sealed jar packed inside a wool blanket. And when they finally arrived in Montana, and the homestead was nothing but cold ground and a leaning shelter, and more sky than either of them had ever seen, her mother had set that jar on the only flat surface they owned and said, "This is how we build something, Evelyn, one morning at a time." She had said it like it was simple. She had said it like she believed it down to the bone. And maybe she had. Maybe that was what faith looked like when it wasn't attached to anything that could be taken away. Ruth Carter died 2 years after they settled in Montana. Fever, fast and mean and final. She was gone in 11 days, and Evelyn buried her in the valley soil and walked back to that cold kitchen and looked at the starter jar on the shelf and sat down on the floor and didn't move for most of the day. She was 22 years old. She had no one. But she kept the starter alive. Every day she fed it. Some days it felt like the only living thing she was responsible for, and some days that was the only reason she got out of bed, because something needed her, even if it was just a jar of wild yeast that didn't know her name. She learned the bread the hard way, the way her mother had begun to teach her before the fever came. She burned it and underbaked it and got the crust wrong for 6 months straight. She cried over failed loaves more times than she wanted to admit. But she kept going. She kept adjusting. She paid attention to the dough the way a good farmer pays attention to weather, not by the calendar, but by feel, by what the air was doing, by how the dough moved under her hands. By the time she was 25, the bread was right. It was not beautiful. It was never beautiful. It was a dark, dense, thick-crusted loaf with a rough surface and a deep, complex flavor that sat in your mouth long after you'd finished eating. It did not look like the bread and bakery windows. It looked like something made by a woman who had been through something and come out the other side still standing. She wrapped it in the cloth that morning. The same cloth her mother had used for cold weather wrapping, faded blue with a small white pattern that had worn down to almost nothing. She held it for a moment before she set it in the basket. She pressed her palms flat against the sides of the loaf, the way you'd press your hands against something warm when you were cold just to feel it. "All right, Mama," she said quietly to the empty kitchen. "Let's see." The Harvest Festival was held in the main hall on Cedar Street, the biggest building in Willow Creek, which was not saying much. It was a long, flat-roofed structure with whitewashed walls and narrow windows that let in strips of thin autumn light. By the time Evelyn arrived, the baking tables were already set up along the back wall, loaded with more food than most of these women made in a week. Decorated cakes with piped frosting that must have taken hours. Pastries with crimped edges and glazed tops. White bread loaves that were identical in their perfection, shaped in tin pans, risen just so golden on top and soft in the middle, the kind of bread that announced immediately that the woman who made it had the time and the resources to make bread that announced things. Evelyn found an open space at the end of the third table and set her basket down. She unwrapped the cloth slowly because she was not going to rush this, not going to fumble it. She set the loaf on the table and smoothed the cloth out beside it and stepped back. She heard the sound before she registered the source. It started as a murmur, then it sharpened into something else. "Good Lord, what is that? Is that supposed to be bread? It looks like a river rock." Evelyn did not move. She kept her eyes on her loaf and her hands flat at her sides, and she breathed through her nose the way her mother had taught her to breathe when something was trying to knock her down. Margaret Whitmore was the one who walked over. She always walked over. That was her gift. She could locate discomfort in a room, the way water locates cracks in stone, and she moved toward it with the specific pleasure of a woman who had never been on the wrong side of a crowd. She was impeccably dressed, as always, in a dark blue dress with ivory buttons, her hair arranged so precisely it looked permanent. She had a husband who owned the largest grain operation in the county, and a smile that never reached the same temperature as her eyes. She looked at Evelyn's bread. She looked at Evelyn. Then she turned very slightly to the women gathered nearby, and she said, "Well, I suppose we're accepting all kinds of entries this year." The laughter was not loud. It didn't need to be. In a room this size, with women this practiced at social cruelty, a low, amused sound carries just as far and lands just as hard. Evelyn felt it in her stomach. A sharp dropping sensation like stepping off a stair that wasn't there. "That crust," one of the younger women said, leaning in close without touching anything, like she might catch something. "Has it already gone wrong, or is it meant to look like that?" "Meant to look like that, I imagine," said another voice behind Evelyn. "Though I can't imagine what the intention was." "Margaret," said a woman named Clara Dobbs, who was not cruel by nature, but had a talent for making cruelty sound reasonable. "Don't you think the judges ought to consider presentation as a criterion? Some of us spent considerable time on that." "Oh, I think the judges will know exactly what to do," Margaret said pleasantly. Evelyn turned her head. She did not think before she spoke. She was done thinking before she spoke. "It's sourdough," she said. "My mother's recipe. 31 years that starter's been kept alive. You don't get that in a bakery window, and you don't get it from a tin pan." She paused. "Some things take time, and they don't come out looking easy. That doesn't mean they aren't worth something." Silence. Margaret tilted her head the way people do when they've heard something they consider faintly entertaining. "How sweet," she said. "A sentimental loaf." More laughter, softer this time, but there. Evelyn turned back to her bread. Her hands were still flat at her sides. She would not clench them. She was not going to give any of these women the satisfaction of watching her hands shake. She had been standing at that table for about 12 minutes when she became aware of a shift in the room. It was subtle, a slight reorientation of attention, the way a group of people unconsciously reorganizes itself around the presence of someone significant. She glanced toward the entrance. Cole Walker had walked in. She knew who he was. Everyone in Willow Creek knew who he was. He owned the Walker Ranch 4,000 acres north of town, a cattle operation that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and moved through a room the way men move who are accustomed to covering long distances on horseback, unhurried, deliberate, with an economy of motion that suggested he had never once in his life wasted effort. He wore a dark coat and a weathered hat, and his boots were clean, but not new, which told Evelyn more than the hat or the coat did, because a man who keeps working boots this long has a reason for keeping them. He was 35 or thereabouts, and he had been a widower for 3 years. His wife Catherine had died in childbirth. The child, a son, had survived. The town talked about Cole Walker with that specific mixture of respect and tragedy that attaches itself to a man who has clearly suffered and has not made a performance of it. Evelyn had seen him at a distance before, in town, outside the feed store. Once from the window of the general store, she had watched him lift a feed sack with one hand and toss it over the side of his wagon like it weighed nothing, and then stand in the street for a moment, looking up at the sky. Not at anything in particular, just looking, and she had thought without meaning to think anything that he looked like a man who carried things. She had not expected him to look at her bread, but he did. He had taken a slow circuit of the room, nodding to people, exchanging a few words here and there, not stopping anywhere for long. And then he reached the baking tables, and Evelyn watched from the corner of her eye as he moved down the line. He looked at the cakes and the pastries and the perfect white loaves with the expression of a man who is assessing something carefully, not to be polite, but because assessment was simply how he engaged with things. And then he stopped. He stopped in front of her bread. Evelyn was very still. Cole Walker looked at her loaf for a long moment. He looked at the color of the crust, the way it had cracked along the scoring line, the rough texture of the surface. He leaned in slightly, just slightly, the way a person does when they want a closer look at something that has caught their interest, not their pity. Then he looked at her. "This yours, ma'am," he said. His voice was low, direct, the voice of a man who had no interest in filling silence with words that didn't mean anything. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Sourdough, yes. Old starter." She met his eyes. 31 years. He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "My grandmother kept a starter for 40 years, he said. "Best bread I ever ate in my life. Nobody could replicate it. Tried. Nobody could get it right." He straightened up. "The flavor in a long starter, it's not something you can fake." Evelyn didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure what was happening. Cole looked back at the loaf. "May I?" he said, and his hand moved toward it, not touching, just indicating. "Go ahead," she said. He broke off a piece from the end carefully, the way you break bread when you're actually intending to eat it rather than performing the gesture, and he put it in his mouth and he chewed it slowly, and his eyes did not leave the middle distance the way a person's eyes go when they're concentrating on something they're tasting. The room had gone quiet. Not immediately, not all at once, but in the way rooms go quiet when people realize something is happening that they should pay attention to. Cole swallowed. He looked at the loaf again. Then he looked at Evelyn. "How much for the whole thing?" he said. Someone nearby made a small sound. Evelyn couldn't tell if it was surprise or amusement, or something else entirely. "It's a contest entry," she said. It's not for sale." "After the contest," he said. "I want to buy it after." Evelyn opened her mouth and closed it again. "You don't have to do that," she said carefully. "I know what you're doing." Cole's expression did not change. "What am I doing?" "You're being kind," she said. "Because of what they said." "No, ma'am." His voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it that was not quiet at all. Something steady and settled and certain in a way that very few voices ever were. "I'm being accurate. That's the best bread in this room." He paused just for a beat. "And I reckon that makes it the best bread in Willow Creek." Margaret Whitmore said from somewhere to Evelyn's left, "Mr. Walker, I'm sure if you'd like to sample some of the other entries, "I've seen the other entries," Cole said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on Evelyn. "I know what I want." The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when a room full of people all realize simultaneously that the social order they thought was fixed has just shifted, and nobody is quite sure what direction things are moving. Margaret's voice came again, a little more pointed now, a little less pleasant. "I'm sure Mrs. Carter appreciates the charity, Cole." Cole turned his head then. Slowly. He looked at Margaret Whitmore, the way a rancher looks at a stretch of fence that's been put up wrong, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of calm, considered attention that in itself carries weight. "It's not charity," he said. "It's honest opinion." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced several coins, which he set on the table beside the loaf, not placed carefully, just set down the way you set something down when you've already decided it belongs somewhere. "Whatever she says it costs, that's what I'll pay. And if she says it's worth more than I've put down, I'll make up the difference." He turned back to Evelyn. She was looking at the coins on the table. There were 4 of them. Silver. She did not need to count them to know that it was more than the bread was worth by any practical measure. She also understood with the specific clarity that comes from years of learning to understand things people won't say out loud that this was not about the bread. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I appreciate it. Truly, but I don't need—" "I know you don't," he said. "That's not why I'm offering." He paused again. That measured, deliberate pause that she would come to understand was simply how he thought that he didn't speak until he was ready to mean it. "My son is 6 years old, and he has never once in his life tasted bread like the bread I ate when I was a boy. My grandmother's been gone 18 years, and I've spent 18 years eating bread that nobody put anything real into." He looked at the loaf. "This bread has something real in it." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Not a dramatic shift, not the kind of thing that shows on a face, just a small quiet movement, like a door opening in a room that had been closed for a long time. "All right," she said. "After the contest." He nodded. "I'll be here." He tipped his hat. A small, clean gesture, nothing performed about it, and he moved off down the table, and the room exhaled, and all around Evelyn, the murmuring started up again, and she stood very still beside her loaf and looked at the coins on the table and breathed. The contest judging happened an hour later. 3 judges moved down the line with clipboards and serious expressions, and Evelyn watched them. She watched them slow down at the decorated cake and linger over the white bread and write things on their clipboards. She watched them reach her loaf, and she watched the hesitation. A slight visible hesitation, and she watched one of them tear off a small piece and taste it with the cautious expression of someone who expects disappointment. She watched him blink. She watched him look at the other 2 judges. She watched one of the other judges taste it. And then the 3rd. They wrote things on their clipboards, and then they moved on. When the results were announced, first place went to Margaret Whitmore's decorated cake. Second place went to Clara Dobbs's white bread. Third place went to a woman named Helen Foster, whose apple pastry was by all accounts technically precise and visually impeccable. Evelyn Carter's bread received no placement, not third, not honorable mention, not a ribbon or a nod or a single word from any of the 3 judges. She stood at that table, and she felt the silence wrap around her like cold water. And she told herself, she said it clearly and firmly inside her own head, the way you talk to yourself when you cannot afford to fall apart in public. She said, "This is not about you. This bread is not about their judgment. This bread is older than any of them, and it will be here after all of them, and the starter will still be alive in that clay jar on your shelf when every one of these women has forgotten they were ever in this room." She believed it. Mostly. She believed it the way you believe things when you have to. She began to fold the cloth back around the loaf. She was steady. Her hands did not shake. She would not give any of them that. And then she heard his voice behind her, and she went completely still. "Miss Carter?" She turned. Cole Walker was standing 2 feet away. He had his hat in his hand. He was holding it at his side, not fidgeting with it, just holding it. And he was looking at her with an expression that was not pity, and was not performance, and was not the specific look she had seen on so many faces in this room today. That look of someone who has found something to feel superior about. He was looking at her like she was someone worth looking at. "Contest's over," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. I believe we had an arrangement." She looked at him for a moment. The coins were still on the table. She hadn't touched them. "Mr. Walker, you really don't have Evelyn," he said her first name. Just like that without asking, and it should have felt presumptuous, and it didn't. It felt like he'd simply decided that formality was the wrong tool for this particular moment. "I told you. I'm not doing this out of kindness. I'm doing it because my boy has never tasted bread worth remembering, and I would like to fix that. Will you let me fix that?" She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the steadiness in his face, the absolute absence of condescension in it, the way he was holding his hat at his side like he was prepared to stand there as long as it took. "Yes," she said. "All right." She handed him the bread still in the cloth. He took it with both hands carefully, like something that mattered. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said earlier about the starter." She paused. "My mother kept it. I don't think many people understand why that's worth why it matters." "It matters," he said simply, like it wasn't a question. He stood there for another moment, and she waited for him to leave, because men like Cole Walker had things to do, and places to go, and whole ranches full of reasons to be somewhere else, and she had given him what he paid for, and that should have been the end of it. But he didn't leave. He said, "I saw you at the church lumber drive last April. You were the one that organized the supply list." She blinked. Yes. Nobody else was doing it." "I know. I noticed." He paused. "And the Harlow family last February, when the pipes froze. I heard you took them food 3 days running." She shook her head. "Anyone would have." "No," he said. "They wouldn't. I know this town, Miss Carter, and I know which people in it actually do things when things need doing." He put his hat back on, slowly settling it into place. "I just wanted you to know that somebody noticed, before today and after today. Somebody was already paying attention." Evelyn Carter stood at the end of that table in the Willow Creek Harvest Festival Hall, with her mother's cloth folded in her hands, and the coins from Cole Walker's pocket on the wood in front of her. And she held herself very still, because something was happening inside her chest that she could not quite name. Something that had not happened in a long time. Something that felt like being seen by someone who was actually looking. Margaret Whitmore was across the room receiving congratulations on her first-place cake, and her voice carried the way voices do when the speaker is confident that the room belongs to them. Evelyn picked up the coins. She folded them into her palm. She looked toward the door where Cole Walker had just walked out, tall and unhurried, with her mother's bread under his arm. Outside, the October sky over Willow Creek was the deep, clear blue that only comes after a long, cold night, and the aspens along the creek had gone gold. Every one of them, and the light through their leaves, was the kind of light that doesn't apologize for being beautiful. She had come in here today thinking she was going to walk out with a ribbon or walk out with nothing. She was walking out with something she did not have a name for yet. Something small and new and careful. Something that felt against every instinct she had developed in 6 years of surviving this town alone, like the beginning of something. She walked out of that hall, and the light hit her face, and she stopped for just a second, just one, and she closed her eyes. Somewhere in her chest, something very old and very tired laid down a weight it had been carrying for longer than she could remember, and she breathed. She carried those coins home in her closed fist the whole walk back to the farmhouse. She didn't count them. She didn't need to. She already knew what they were worth, and it had nothing to do with the silver. The farmhouse was cold when she got in the way. It always was in October, when she'd been gone more than a few hours, and she built the fire back up without thinking, moving through the familiar motions of kindling and striker and breath, and she set the kettle on and stood at the counter and stared at the clay jar on the shelf. The starter sat there the same as it always had. Quiet. Patient. Alive in the particular way that living things are alive when they've been tended long enough. Not dramatically, not loudly, just steadily. The way a heartbeat is steady, the way breathing is steady, the way certain things continue simply because someone chose not to let them stop. She put the coins on the shelf beside the jar. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she said out loud to the empty kitchen and the clay jar, and the memory of her mother that lived in both of them. Someone noticed Mama. Somebody was already paying attention. The fire caught. The kettle began to heat. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain the way it always did in October, cold and purposeful, and Evelyn Carter stood in her small kitchen and felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. Not hope. Not yet. Something quieter than hope. Something that lived just underneath it. She told herself not to attach anything to what had happened today. Cole Walker was a practical man who wanted good bread for his son. That was the beginning and the end of it. She had sold him a loaf, and he had been decent about it, and decent men existed in the world, and that was worth acknowledging, and then setting down carefully, and not picking back up and turning over in her hands in the dark, until it meant something it didn't mean. She told herself that for about 4 days. On the 5th day, he rode up to her gate. She was out in the yard splitting wood when she heard the horse, and she straightened up and turned around, and there he was. Cole Walker on a dark bay gelding, sitting easy in the saddle. The way men sit when riding is as natural to them as walking, his hat pulled low against the morning glare. She lowered the axe. He swung down from the horse and looped the reins over the fence post and walked toward her, and he was holding his hat in his hand before he reached her, which she would come to understand was simply how he was. He removed his hat when he was about to say something he meant. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Walker." She set the axe against the woodpile. "I wasn't expecting company." "I know it. I should have sent word." He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to be respectful about it. "I won't stay long. My boy ate that bread." She waited. "He ate 3 pieces at supper," Cole said. "And then he asked me where it came from, and I told him, and he said—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. Something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. He said, "Can we get more?" Just like that. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Evelyn looked at him. "He's 6, Cole said. "He doesn't say that about food. He barely eats half the time. His aunt, she cooks for us. She's a fine woman and a decent cook, but it's not." He paused, and she could see him searching for the right word. The honest word, the one that said what he meant without saying more than he intended. "It's not the same as what you made." "What's his name?" Evelyn said. "Your boy." "James," Cole said. "We call him Jamie." How old was he when his mother died? The question came out before she'd decided to ask it. She almost apologized. But Cole didn't flinch. 3, he said. He doesn't remember her. That's the part that... He stopped again. He doesn't have anything of hers. Not really. She didn't leave much behind. He looked down at his hat in his hands. I try to give him things that feel like permanence, things that have a history to them, things that were made with something real. He looked back up at her. "That's what your bread is. That's why I came back." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I can make another loaf," she said. "It'll take a day. The starter needs—" "I'll pay you properly," he said, "whatever your time is worth." "I know you will," she said. "That's not what I was going to say." She looked at him steadily. "I was going to say come back Thursday. It'll be ready Thursday." He nodded, put his hat back on. "Thursday, then." He turned toward the horse, and then he stopped and he turned back. "Miss Carter, those women at the festival. What they said about your bread, Mr. Walker." "I'm not bringing it up to make you uncomfortable," he said. "I'm bringing it up because I want you to hear it said plainly. They were wrong. About the bread. About all of it." He held her eyes. "I've been running cattle for 15 years, and I've learned one thing that's worth anything, and it's this: the things that look the roughest on the outside are almost always the things with the most in them. A man who can't see that doesn't know what he's looking at. Evelyn Carter stood in her yard with her hands at her sides and the cold October wind coming down off the mountain, and she looked at Cole Walker with an expression that she could not have described if someone had asked her to, and she said very quietly, "Thursday." "Thursday," he agreed. He mounted up easy and unhurried, and he rode back down the lane, and she watched him go until the horse cleared the line of trees, and then she turned back to the woodpile and picked up the axe and swung it, and the wood split clean down the middle, and she stood there for a moment breathing hard, though not from the effort. He came back Thursday. She had the bread on the counter wrapped in a clean cloth, and she had also, without entirely meaning to, or perhaps meaning to more than she wanted to admit, made a pot of coffee. It was good coffee, the strong kind, the kind her mother had made every morning of her life without apology. And when Cole Walker knocked at the door and she opened it, and the smell of the coffee reached him, something in his face shifted. "Come in," she said. "If you want." He came in. He sat at her kitchen table, which was a thing that had not happened. A man sitting at that table in 6 years, and Evelyn set the coffee down in front of him, and sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the other kind. "You built this yourself," he said, looking at the shelves along the wall. "These shelves. The previous owner built the house," she said. "But those shelves, yes, and the counter. Good work," he said. He said it the same way he said everything without decoration, like the words were exactly the right ones and there was no reason to add more. "My father taught me," she said, "before he passed. He said a woman living alone needs to know how to fix the things that break because no one's going to do it for her." She paused. "He wasn't wrong." "No," Cole said. He wasn't. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and looked at it, and she had the sense that he was deciding something, working through something, in that deliberate way of his. Then he said, "Can I ask you something that isn't my business?" "You can ask," she said. "I'll tell you if it isn't." The corner of his mouth moved. "How long have you been on this property alone?" 6 years, she said. "And before, my mother and I came out from Missouri when I was 22. She died 2 years after we arrived." She said it plainly without inflection. She had said it enough times that she knew how to say it without it taking something from her. "I've been running this place on my own since then." Cole looked at her across the table. 4 years alone on a homestead this size. It's not so large. It's not small either. He set the cup down. "You dug out the east drainage yourself. I saw the line coming up the lane." She blinked. "You noticed that?" "I notice things about land," he said. "It's what I do. And that drainage line that's not simple work. That's weeks of work." "It was," she said. "Late summer 2 years ago. I did it over 6 weeks, mornings before the heat." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because the field was flooding every spring and I was losing a third of my crop. Why else?" Something in his face changed again. Not the almost smile this time. Something more serious than that. Something that looked like genuine respect, which was different from the performative kind she occasionally received from people who felt sorry for her. "Why does everyone in this town act like you're—" He stopped. He picked his words carefully. "Like you're less than what you are." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Because it's easier," she said finally. "If I'm less than what I am, then they don't have to think too hard about the fact that I'm doing things they couldn't do. And I don't look like what this town thinks a woman ought to look like, so—" She shrugged. One short, honest movement. "It's just easier for everyone if I'm less." Cole was looking at her in a way that made her want to look somewhere else, so she did. She looked at the clay jar on the shelf. "My grandmother was a large woman," he said. "Biggest personality in any room she walked into, ran a household of 9, and managed the books for my grandfather's operation, and never once in her life apologized for taking up space." He paused. "She used to say the people who want you to be smaller are the people who are afraid of how much room you actually deserve." Evelyn turned her head back to look at him. He was watching her steadily. "That's a thing your grandmother said?" she asked. "It's a thing I say now," he said. "She just taught it to me first." The coffee had gone warm rather than hot by the time he left, and they had talked for nearly 2 hours, which was not what either of them had come to the table expecting. He asked her about the farm, and she answered, and she asked him about his ranch, and he answered, and they disagreed twice about cattle management and grain rotation, and Evelyn held her position both times without softening it, because she had the evidence and the experience, and she was not in the habit of backing down from things she knew to be true. The second time she disagreed with him, Cole Walker leaned back in his chair and looked at her and said, Just that. Not defensive, not dismissive, just a man genuinely reconsidering. "I'll look at that differently," he said, and she believed him. He left with the bread and a somewhat larger quantity of her coffee grounds than she had strictly intended to give him because he had asked what kind it was, and she had told him. And he had said he hadn't been able to find it at the Willow Creek Mercantile, and she had said she ordered it from a supplier in Helena, and somehow in the process of explaining that she had wrapped up half her supply and put it in a bag before she fully registered what she was doing. She stood at the door after he rode away and looked at the bag-shaped absence on her counter and felt warmly quietly something she was not ready to name. The third visit came 8 days later, and he did not come alone. Evelyn heard 2 sets of hoofbeats and looked out the window and felt her heart do something involuntary when she saw the small figure on the pony riding alongside Cole's gelding. A boy, slight and serious-looking, with dark hair under a too large hat, and Cole's same quality of stillness about him, that particular kind of stillness that is not absence, but attention. She went out to the gate. Cole dismounted and then lifted the boy down from the pony, and the boy stood beside his father and looked at Evelyn with large dark eyes that were doing the same careful work his father's eyes did, assessing, measuring, not unkindly. "Miss Carter," Cole said, "this is James, my son. He wanted to come." Evelyn looked down at the boy. "Hello, James." "Hello, ma'am," the boy said, serious as stone. "My pa says you make the bread." "I do," she said. "He says it's the best bread in Montana." "He said that, did he?" "Yes, ma'am. He says things he means." Evelyn looked up at Cole, who was watching this exchange with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded she'd seen on his face, and she looked back down at Jamie and said, "Well, your pa has good taste. Do you want to come in and see how it's made?" The boy looked at his father. Cole nodded once. The boy looked back at Evelyn. "Yes, please," he said. And that was how Jamie Walker ended up at Evelyn Carter's kitchen table at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, watching her feed the starter with the concentration of a child who has been told something is important and has decided to take that seriously. He sat very still on the wooden chair with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes moving between the clay jar and Evelyn's hands with the expression of someone taking notes. "Why does it bubble?" he asked. "Because it's alive," she said. He considered that. "Like a horse. In a way, it needs food and air and attention. If you ignore it, it dies. Pa says that about the cattle." "Your pa's right." "He usually is," Jamie said without any particular pride, just as a statement of fact. "Sometimes he's wrong, though. He doesn't think so, but sometimes he is." Evelyn kept her face neutral. She did not look at Cole, who was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his hat in his hands. "What does he get wrong?" she asked the boy. Jamie appeared to think carefully about this. "He thinks you don't need to say good night to horses before you close the barn. I think you do." He paused. "And he puts too much salt in the eggs." "Those seem like important things," Evelyn said. "They are," Jamie confirmed. Cole said from the doorframe without any particular inflection, "I can hear both of you." "We know," Jamie said. Evelyn did look at Cole, then just briefly, and something passed between them that was not quite laughter and was not quite anything else either. Something warm and human and entirely involuntary. The kind of thing that happens between people when a child says exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, and there is no prepared response, and so the real one shows through. Cole looked away first. He looked at his hat. She looked back at the jar. The bread took 2 hours from that point, and Jamie stayed for every minute of it. He asked questions with the relentlessness of a child who has decided that a subject is interesting, which meant he asked about the flour and the water and the temperature, and whether the oven was the same as a blacksmith's forge, which it was not, and whether the bread talked while it was baking, which it did not. Exactly, though she told him if he put his ear near enough to the crust, right after it came out, he could hear it crackle, and the look on his face when she said that was the same look she imagined his father must have had 30 years ago when someone told him something true about the world for the first time. He did put his ear near the crust when it came out. He listened for a full 30 seconds, and then he straightened up and said, "It's talking." "It's telling you it's done," Evelyn said. "How do you know what it's saying?" "You learn," she said. "Same way you learn anything. You pay attention long enough, and things start to make sense." Jamie nodded seriously and climbed back onto his chair, and Cole was looking at his son with an expression that Evelyn caught only because she happened to be looking in that direction at that particular moment. And what she saw on his face, just for that second, just before he noticed her noticing, was something so undefended and raw and completely real that it sent an ache straight through her before she could stop it. He missed his wife. That was part of it. But it was more than that. He was looking at his son with a kind of hungry gratitude. The look of a man who loves something so much it occasionally frightens him, and who had been carrying that love alone for 3 years, and who had just watched his quiet, serious, motherless boy lean toward a loaf of bread and decide it was telling him something and believe it, and who was, for just that moment, devastatingly, quietly grateful. She looked away. She began to cut the bread. They sat at her table and ate bread with butter and drank coffee. Evelyn and Cole, while Jamie drank cold water, because he had decided apparently that he did not trust coffee, which was fair, and ate 4 pieces of bread, which was not something Cole was expecting. "He ate 3 last time," Cole said, watching his son with visible satisfaction. "You've done something." "It's good bread," Jamie said, apparently considering this a full and complete explanation. "It is," Cole agreed. He looked at Evelyn. "It is?" he said again, and he meant more than the bread, and she knew it, and she felt her face do something she couldn't control. Something warm that moved up from her neck, and she looked down at her plate. They stayed 3 hours. It was the longest 3 hours she had spent in company in years. And when Cole finally said they needed to get back, the light was going. The ride home was an hour he had fencing to check before dark. Jamie slid off the chair and went to the door and then turned back and said with the solemnity of a child making a formal statement, "Miss Carter, this was a good visit." "It was," she agreed. "Can we come back?" She looked at him. She looked at his father standing beside him, not answering for him, letting the question sit exactly where the boy had put it, which was directly and without maneuvering, which was, she was beginning to understand simply how the Walker men operated. "Yes," she said. "You can come back." Jamie nodded, satisfied, and went to his pony, and Cole paused at the door and looked at her and said very quietly, "Thank you for how you were with him. He's a remarkable child," she said. "I know." He settled his hat. His mother would have, she'd have been. He stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "Thank you. Come back Thursday," she said. "I'll have fresh bread and I'll show him how the scoring works. He'll want to know about the scoring." Something moved through Cole Walker's expression, something complicated and layered and deeply human, and he said, "Thursday." He walked out and she watched from the doorway as he mounted up and checked that Jamie was secure on the pony, and they rode down the lane together. The tall man and the small boy. And the last thing she saw before the trees took them was Jamie talking enthusiastically from the movement of his hands, and Cole leaning slightly toward him to listen, and the sight of it did something to her chest that she pressed her hand flat against the doorframe to contain. Thursday came, and the Thursday after that. By the 3rd Thursday she stopped calling him Mr. Walker, and he stopped calling her Miss Carter, and that itself felt like a threshold crossed, though neither of them said so. "Cole," she said one morning over coffee, "do you know what Margaret Whitmore told the minister's wife about you?" He looked up from his cup. "I generally make a point of not knowing what Margaret Whitmore says about anything." "She said you've gone peculiar," Evelyn told him. "She said a man of your standing spending his Thursday mornings at a farmhouse on the edge of the valley is a sign of some kind of spell, and she's worried for you." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Worried," he said. "Apparently, Margaret Whitmore," he said slowly, "has spent 40 years organizing the social life of this town around the principle that the right people associate with the right people and everyone else stays where they belong." He set his cup down. "The idea that I might want to spend my Thursday morning somewhere she didn't assign me to be is not a sign of a spell. It's a sign that I disagree with her system." Evelyn looked at him. "I've disagreed with it a long time," he said. "I just haven't had a particular reason to demonstrate it until now." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. But then came the morning late November, the first real cold of the season, when Evelyn arrived at the general store to find Margaret Whitmore already there, and not alone, and not in a mood to perform the version of social politeness that they had both been managing at a functional distance for the past several weeks. She was with two other women, Helen Foster and a woman named Ada Chambers, whose husband had sat on the town council for a dozen years and who therefore believed herself to be in possession of a certain social authority that she was always looking for opportunities to deploy. Evelyn was at the counter getting her order together when Margaret's voice came not whispered, not even lowered. "I understand she's been entertaining Cole at her property," Ada said. "Regularly," Margaret confirmed. "Well," Helen Foster's voice had the quality of a woman who is uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to leave. "He's a grown man. He can make his own choices." "He's a grieving man," Margaret said. "And grief makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise consider." A pause. I don't doubt she's kind in her way. But she is not the right kind of woman for Cole Walker. His children deserve better than that." Evelyn went very still at the counter. "His child," Helen said, quietly correcting. "His child," Margaret agreed. "Who deserves a mother with appropriate standing, with community ties, with," she seemed to search, "with refinement." "With a smaller waist," said Ada Chambers, and laughed, and Margaret did not correct her. The store was not large. The counter was 12 feet from where those women were standing. The clerk, a young man named Thomas, who had been working at the general store for 2 years, and who Evelyn had always treated with straightforward kindness, was looking at a spot on the wall approximately 8 inches above Evelyn's head. Evelyn set her hand flat on the counter. She said quietly to Thomas, "Add 3 pounds of oats to the order, please." Her voice was even. Her hand was flat. Her spine was straight. Thomas wrote the oats down without looking at her. Behind her, the conversation shifted to something else, a social event, a meeting someone's new curtains, with the casual ease of people who have said what they intended to say and have no further interest in the aftermath. Evelyn picked up her basket. She walked out of that store with her head level and her eyes forward, and she did not stop walking until she was around the corner and in the narrow alley between the store and the livery where nobody was, and she set the basket down on the frozen ground and pressed both hands against the livery wall and breathed. She was not crying. She was not going to cry. She was 30 years old, and she had been hearing things like that since she was 22, and she was not going to stand in an alley behind a livery in Willow Creek, Montana, and cry over Ada Chambers and her cruelties. But her hands were shaking, just slightly, just barely, and the thing that was shaking was not embarrassment anymore. It was something older and harder and more dangerous than embarrassment. It was rage, not the hot, sharp kind, the cold kind. The kind that has been compressed over years until it is very small and very dense and completely contained, and that sits behind your sternum like a stone, and that does not go away, no matter how many times you tell yourself, "It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter." She stood there for a long moment. Then she picked up her basket, and then she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her, and she turned around, and Cole Walker was standing at the entrance to the alley. He was not supposed to be in town today. He had not said anything about coming to town. He was holding a length of hardware chain that meant he'd been to the blacksmith on the far end of the street, and his face, when he looked at her, told her everything she needed to know about how much of what had happened in that store he had heard. They looked at each other. "Cole," she said, "don't." "Don't what?" he said carefully. "Don't go back in there and make it worse." He was very still. "I wasn't going to go back in there." She looked at him. "Then what are you going to do?" He walked toward her. Not fast, not angry on the surface, but she had spent enough time with this man now to read what was underneath the surface, and what was underneath it right now was a very cold, very controlled, very absolute fury. He stopped in front of her, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her that first day over her bread, like he was seeing something exactly as it was, and not as anyone else had told him to see it. "Evelyn," he said, "I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening." What they said in there. He paused. "It is not about you. It is about them. It is about what it does to people when they have organized their whole lives around being better than someone else, and then something comes along that challenges the arrangement." He held her eyes. "You have been surviving this alone for years, and you have done it without once becoming what they are. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand how rare that is?" She looked at him. Something in her chest was cracking very slightly, the way ice cracks in spring, not breaking, not collapsing, just giving just slightly under pressure it has held against for too long. "I'm not fragile," she said. "I don't need protecting." "I know," he said. "But I need to say it anyway, because somebody should have said it a long time ago." His voice was low and entirely level, and it was the most serious voice she had ever heard come out of another human being. "You are not less than them, Evelyn. You are not less than anyone in this valley. And I will say that to anyone who suggests otherwise publicly by name as many times as it needs to be said." The wind moved through the alley between them. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the chain in his hand, and the set of his jaw, and the absolute steadiness in his eyes, and she thought about a clay jar of sourdough starter that had been kept alive for 31 years through faith and attention, and the refusal to let something valuable die just because the circumstances were hard. She thought about what it meant to keep something alive. She thought about what it cost. She said, "You should know that if you keep showing up like this, people are going to talk." "People are already talking," Cole said. "They'll say worse things." "Let them," he said. "I've been letting this town set the terms of my life since Catherine died, and I'm done with it." He looked at her steadily. "Are you?" It was not a simple question. She understood that. It was a question with weight to it, with consequence, with the kind of implication that she could not unpack in an alley in November, with her hands still slightly unsteady from what she'd heard in that store. But she looked at Cole Walker, this man who showed up on Thursdays, this man who let his son believe bread could talk, this man who had put silver coins on a table in front of people who were laughing and said, "This is the one I want," without flinching. "Yes, Evelyn," Carter said. The word sat between them in the cold air like something solid. "Yes," she said again. "I'm done with it." The word yes held in the cold air between them like a lit match, and neither of them moved to blow it out. Cole looked at her for one more long moment, and then he nodded that same single clean nod she had come to understand meant he had heard something, and he was taking it seriously, and he was not going to waste words on top of it. He put his hat back on and picked up the hardware chain from where he'd set it against the wall and said, "I'll ride out Thursday." And she said, "Thursday." And they walked out of that alley in opposite directions, and Evelyn went home with her basket of goods and her 3 pounds of oats, and her chest full of something that was too new and too large to have a name yet. She did not sleep well that night, or the next night either. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind off the mountain, and thought about the way Cole's voice had sounded when he said, "I will say that to anyone who suggests otherwise publicly by name." Not a threat, not a performance, just a statement of what he had already decided, said in the tone of a man announcing a fixed point. The way you'd say, "The sun rises in the east." the way you'd say water runs downhill. A thing that was simply true, and that he had committed to the way he committed to all things, without flourish, without negotiation, without any apparent awareness that it was supposed to be difficult. She thought about what it would cost him, because it would cost him something. That was the thing about Willow Creek that people who had never had reason to fall outside its approval, never had to reckon with the cost, was real. It was not dramatic. It was not a single confrontation, or a public shaming, or a clear enemy to face. It was small, and it was cumulative, and it was everywhere. It was the way business slowed at the feed store if you were associated with the wrong people. It was the way church seating arranged itself. It was the way invitations stopped coming, and contracts became slightly more complicated, and the whole invisible architecture of a small town's goodwill quietly rerouted itself around you. Evelyn knew that cost intimately. And Cole Walker. Cole Walker, with his 4,000 acres and his 3 generations of Montana roots, and his name on the side of the valley's most respected cattle operation, Cole Walker was about to pay it. For her. She was not sure what to do with that. Thursday came cold and bright, and he rode up at 9 in the morning as usual, and Jamie was with him again, which had become the pattern Jamie almost always came, which Evelyn had stopped trying to read anything particular into, and had simply begun to enjoy for what it was, which was one of the finer things that had happened to her Thursday mornings in recent memory. Jamie walked in ahead of his father, and went directly to the clay jar on the shelf, with the focus of a child checking on something he considers partially his responsibility. And he said, "It looks good," with evident satisfaction, and Evelyn said, "It's been good this week." And Jamie climbed up onto his chair and folded his hands and waited to see what they were making. Cole came in behind him, and he looked at Evelyn, and she looked at him, and they had a brief entire conversation, with no words in it, which amounted to, "Are you all right?" and "Yes," and "Are you sure?" and "Yes," and "All right then." And they moved on to coffee. That morning she taught Jamie how to score the dough. She gave him a small knife dull-backed enough to be safe, sharp enough to matter, and she showed him the angle, and the depth, and the motion, and he practiced on a small piece of extra dough she'd set aside for exactly that purpose, his tongue between his teeth, his small face compressed with concentration. His first score was crooked. "It went sideways," he said, unhappy. "They all do the first time," she said. "Did yours?" "My first 50 went sideways," she said. He considered this. "How do you get it straight?" "You do it again," she said. "And then again. And you pay attention to what you're doing wrong each time until doing it right becomes the thing your hand knows how to do." Jamie looked at the crooked score in the dough. Then he looked at her. "Can I try again?" "That's why I gave you extra," she said. He tried again. Still not straight, but closer. He tried a third time and got it close enough that Evelyn said, "There. That's the one. See how different that felt." "My hand knew," Jamie said with a kind of wondering seriousness that stopped her for a second. "Your hand knew," she confirmed. Cole from across the kitchen. "He's going to want to score every loaf from now on." "Good," Evelyn said. "It needs doing." She did not look at Cole when she said it, but she felt his eyes on the side of her face, and she felt the warmth of them, and she kept her attention on the dough. The bread went into the oven. Jamie was persuaded to eat something while they waited eggs and toast, and he ate with the focused efficiency of a child who views meals primarily as a practical requirement, and would prefer to be doing something else, and then immediately asked if the bread was done yet. And Cole told him no, and he asked again 8 minutes later, and Cole told him no again, and Evelyn said, "Come here," and brought him to the oven, and told him to listen, and he put his ear to the side of the oven, and his eyes went wide. "I can hear it," he said. "That's the heat working," she told him. "The bread's building itself right now. You can hear it if you pay attention. Like it's growing." Exactly like that. He stood there with his ear against the oven for a full minute, entirely, still entirely absorbed, and Cole stood in the kitchen doorway, watching his son listen to bread bake with the expression of a man who is filing something away in his memory, very carefully, making sure he doesn't lose it. It was that day, that ordinary, warm, bread-smelling Thursday morning, that Margaret Whitmore chose to pay a visit to the Walker Ranch. They didn't know about it until afterward. Cole found out that evening when his housekeeper, a steady woman named Mrs. Pierce, who had been with the Walker family for 11 years, and who Evelyn would later come to understand was one of the finest people in the entire valley, sent a message out to the east pasture where Cole was working. The message said, "Mrs. Whitmore came calling today. She brought a woman with her I did not recognize. They asked questions about your schedule and about the Carter property. I told them I don't discuss Mr. Walker's schedule. They left something on the front table that you should read before Jamie sees it." Cole read that note standing in the east pasture in the early dark, and he folded it once and put it in his coat pocket and finished the fence line he was working on because he had learned a long time ago that reacting to provocations immediately was almost always worse than finishing the work in front of you first. He got home, saw Jamie fed and settled with Mrs. Pierce, and went to the front table. What Margaret Whitmore had left was a letter. Handwritten on her ivory stationery, sealed, addressed to Cole Walker in the precise, controlled penmanship of a woman who had practiced her handwriting the way other women practice their social weaponry because they were the same thing. He read it standing at the table. It took him about 2 minutes. He set it down. He stood there for a moment looking at the wall. Then he went to his desk, took out paper, wrote a response that was 4 sentences long, sealed it, and asked Mrs. Pierce to have it delivered to the Whitmore house first thing in the morning. He did not tell Evelyn about the letter that week. He did not tell her the following Thursday either. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment, and some part of him knew that wasn't entirely true. Some part of him was waiting because he was not sure how she would react, and he had gotten very used to her reactions mattering to him, which was itself a thing he was still finding his footing around. He told her the third Thursday after the letter arrived in early December, when the first real snow had come down off the mountain, and the valley was quiet and muffled, and the kind of cold that made a warm kitchen feel like a mercy. Jamie was in the corner, working on a puzzle Mrs. Pierce had sent with them, and Cole said very quietly so. Only Evelyn could hear, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him over her coffee. "Margaret Whitmore came to my house," he said. 6 weeks ago. She left a letter." Evelyn set her cup down. She outlined, Cole said, choosing every word precisely, "her concerns about my relationship with you." Her argument was essentially that you are not suited to the Walker family's standing, that Jamie deserves better, that my late wife's memory deserves better. He paused. She suggested that if I continued in this direction, she would feel it necessary to raise the matter with the church deacon and the town council chair, both of whom are personal friends of her husband. The kitchen was quiet. The puzzle pieces clicked softly from the corner. "She threatened you," Evelyn said. "She tried to," Cole said. "She doesn't have anything to threaten me with. My land title is clean, my business is solvent, and I don't owe Robert Whitmore anything." He looked at her steadily. "But I wanted you to know, because it will get worse before it gets better. She's not going to stop, and I need you to know that going in." Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. She turned them over, looked at her palms. Broad, calloused, capable hands, the hands of a woman who had spent years doing things that needed doing with no one to help her do them. "What did you write back to her?" she asked. Cole's expression shifted, just slightly, that almost thing that wasn't quite a smile. "I told her that my schedule and my associations were my own business, that if she wished to take her concerns to the deacon or the council chair, she was welcome to, but that I did not expect to change my behavior on that account, and that I would appreciate it if she did not come to my home again without an invitation." Evelyn stared at him. "Cole, I meant every word of it. I know you did. That's—" She stopped. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then, "That's going to make things very difficult for you." "Probably," he agreed. "Cole, this isn't just social discomfort. She can make things genuinely hard. Her husband sits on the land committee. If he decides to review your water rights or your—" "Let him," Cole said. "My water rights are solid, and he knows it. And the minute he tries anything without legal basis, he will find out that I have a lawyer in Helena who has been waiting for exactly that kind of move for 3 years. Something hardened underneath the quiet in his voice. "I am not afraid of Robert Whitmore, Evelyn, and I am not afraid of his wife. I have spent 3 years afraid of nothing except losing my son, and I will tell you from experience that once you know what real fear feels like, Margaret Whitmore is a very small problem." Jamie looked up from his puzzle. "Pa, you're talking loud." Cole looked at his son. "Sorry," he said. Jamie looked at Evelyn. "He talks loud when he's decided something," he said, informational helpful. "I know," Evelyn said. "Thank you, Jamie." Jamie went back to his puzzle. Evelyn looked at Cole, and Cole looked at Evelyn, and something was happening between them that was no longer the careful, measured thing it had been in October. No longer the sensible thing she had been telling herself to keep it as. And she could feel it happening, and she could feel her own resistance to it, and she could feel that resistance losing, and she was not entirely sure how she felt about that. She was sure about one thing: she was not going to let this man face Margaret Whitmore's machinery alone. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "I'm not going to sit at the edge of the valley and pretend it isn't happening. I know. If she takes this to the council, I'm going to be there. I know that too." She looked at him. "You planned on this." "I planned on you," he said simply, and then immediately looked like he was considering whether he'd said too much, and then apparently decided he hadn't, because he didn't take it back. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment in the warm, bread-smelling kitchen, while snow came down outside, and Jamie clicked puzzle pieces together in the corner, and she said, "You are a very stubborn man." "Yes," he said. "I find it irritating." "I know," he said. "You've mentioned it. I'll probably keep mentioning it." "I expect so," he said. And there it was, the thing that wasn't quite a smile fully committed to, now real, reaching his eyes, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest, with a warmth she had entirely given up the pretense of not feeling. The trouble Margaret Whitmore had been building did not come all at once. It came the way trouble in a small town always comes incrementally socially, through 100 small adjustments that each seemed minor individually and were devastating collectively. The feed store. Thomas Giles, who owned it and who had always been perfectly civil to Evelyn, began to be less available when she came in. Not rude, just slow, just slightly inattentive. Just the kind of treatment that made the transaction take twice as long as it should, and left her standing longer than necessary before anyone acknowledged she was there. The church. Evelyn did not place much social weight on the church, but she attended regularly because the minister was a decent man, and because she had made a habit of it, and habits were in her experience the architecture of a life. After Margaret's campaign began, she noticed that the pew she usually sat in was consistently occupied when she arrived, though it had never been occupied before. She sat elsewhere. The following week, that pew was occupied too. She sat in the back. The minister noticed. He was a quieter man than the politics of his congregation sometimes required him to be, but he was not blind. He came to Evelyn after the service one Sunday and said quietly, "Miss Carter, I want you to know that this church has no position on who sits where, and never will while I'm standing at that pulpit." "Thank you, Reverend," she said. "I also want you to know," he said slightly more carefully, "that there are people in this congregation who do not share Mrs. Whitmore's opinions. They are perhaps less vocal about it, but they are there." She thanked him again and went home, and she thought about that as she fed the starter that afternoon. Less vocal. Less vocal was different from silent. Less vocal meant there was something to speak, and people who might be moved to speak it under the right circumstances. She was thinking about that when the real blow landed. It came on a Tuesday in late December, 2 days before Christmas. And it came not from Margaret Whitmore directly, but from a man named Gerald Holt, who was the Willow Creek representative of the Territorial Land Registry, and who had until that point been a largely invisible figure in Evelyn's life. He came to her door in the morning with a document. Official-looking. Territorial seal at the top. He was apologetic. He was almost genuinely apologetic, which made it worse somehow. He told her that there had been a review of the homestead records for properties in the East Valley, and that it had come to the registry's attention that her original claim documentation had a discrepancy. The acreage recorded in the original filing did not match the survey markers currently in place, and under territorial regulations, a discrepancy of that nature required a formal resurvey before the claim could be confirmed. Until the resurvey was completed, her title was in provisional status. He left her the paperwork. She closed the door and stood in her kitchen and read every line of it 3 times. She had filed that claim herself 6 years ago, with her mother still alive, to help her navigate the process. She had kept every document. She had the original survey maps. She had the correspondence with the registry office. She had all of it in a box under the floorboard beneath her bed because her mother had told her to keep it safe, and her mother had been right about most things that mattered. Her hands were not shaking. She was past shaking. She put on her coat. She walked to town. She went directly to Gerald Holt's office on the main street, and she walked in without knocking, and she set her original filing documents on his desk in a neat stack, and she said, "Mr. Holt, I'd like to show you something." Gerald Holt looked at the stack of documents. He looked at Evelyn. He looked slightly ill. "Miss Carter, my original survey was conducted by Edward Mills in the spring of 1878, she said. The acreage recorded matches the markers placed by Mr. Mills exactly. I have his original field notes. I have the correspondence from your office confirming receipt of the claim. I have every document in the chain from the date of filing to today." She held his eyes. "Would you like to tell me who requested this review?" He looked at the documents. He looked at the wall behind her head. She realized, a man who was fundamentally uncomfortable with what he had been asked to do, which meant he had been asked by someone whose discomfort he feared more than hers. "The review was flagged by the standard audit process," he said without conviction. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I grew up watching my father deal with men who said things without meaning them, and I learned early to tell the difference. Please don't do me the discourtesy." He was quiet for a moment. "The request," he said finally, "came through the council office." "Robert Whitmore," she said. "He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it." She looked at the documents on his desk. "Review them," she said. "Take as long as you need. When you've reviewed them, you'll find that my claim is clean and has been since 1878, and there is no legal basis for provisional status." She paused. "And when you've reached that conclusion, I would appreciate a written confirmation from this office, signed and dated, clearing the claim permanently." She walked out. She was 2 blocks from the registry office when she heard Cole's voice behind her. She stopped. She turned around. He was there, not on horseback, on foot, which meant he'd been in town already, which meant he'd heard something. His face was the controlled version of the face he made when he had decided something and had no remaining patience for the time it was taking to execute it. "I heard," he said before she could speak. "How?" "Tom Briggs at the blacksmith overheard Holt talking to the deputy yesterday." His voice was completely even. "Evelyn, this is Robert Whitmore. He's using Gerald Holt to—" "I know," she said. "I just dealt with it." He stopped. "You what?" "I went to the registry office," she said. "I showed Holt my original documents. I asked for a written confirmation clearing the claim." She looked at him steadily. "My paperwork is clean, Cole. It always was. This is harassment, not a legal problem. And now Holt knows that I know, and he also knows that if he doesn't produce that confirmation, he has a real problem on his hands." Cole Walker looked at her. He stood in the December street and looked at her, and something moved through his expression that was more complicated than she expected. There was relief in it, and there was admiration, and there was something else underneath both of those. Something that looked very much like a man arriving at a conclusion he had been approaching for a long time and finally stepping across the threshold. "I was coming to help," he said. "I know," she said. "I appreciate it." "You didn't need it." "I didn't need it this time," she said. "That doesn't mean I won't need it." She looked at him carefully. "It also doesn't mean it didn't matter that you were coming." He held her eyes. "Evelyn," he said. "Cole," she said in the same tone. They were standing in the middle of the street in Willow Creek, Montana in December, in plain view of anyone who happened to be looking, which was by reasonable estimation most of the town. He reached out and took her hand. Not the way you take someone's hand to escort them somewhere. The way you take someone's hand when you've decided something, and you want the deciding to be a thing you do together. She looked down at their joined hands. She looked back up at him. "People are going to see this," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's what you want." "I want you to know where I stand," he said. "This is where I stand." There was a sound, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere to their left. She didn't look. She didn't need to. She could feel the attention of the street landing on them like a change in weather pressure. And she knew that within the hour, this moment would have been described to Margaret Whitmore in accurate and comprehensive detail. Good, she thought, with a clarity that surprised her. Let her see it. Let all of them see it. She did not pull her hand away. "I should warn you," she said, "that I am not easy to live alongside. I have opinions about everything, and I do not soften them on request, and I repaired every broken thing on my property myself for 4 years, which means I have strong ideas about how repairs should be done, and I will tell you if you're doing something wrong." "I know," he said. "You've already told me twice about the fence post spacing." "The spacing was wrong." "The spacing was fine." "It was not fine, Cole, and you know it." Something that was fully, genuinely, completely a smile broke across his face, open and real, and entirely unlike the careful, almost expressions she had been cataloging for months. And she felt it hit her like the first warm day after a long winter, sudden and physical and impossible to prepare for. "No," he said, still smiling. "It wasn't fine." She looked at him in the December street with his hand around hers, and snow beginning to come down very softly from a flat white sky, and she said, "The written confirmation from Holt's office will come through, and when it does, I want you to be there when I file the response." "I'll be there," he said. "And I want whoever Robert Whitmore sends to approach this again, to look me in the eyes when they do it," she said, "so they understand exactly what they're dealing with." "They will," Cole said. "I'll make sure of it." She looked at him. He looked at her. The snow came down between them soft and unhurried, and Cole Walker held Evelyn Carter's hand in the middle of Willow Creek's main street on a Tuesday in December, and every person who saw it understood without a single word being said that something had shifted in this town's arrangement of who stood where and who stood with whom. And from the window of the mercantile across the street, Margaret Whitmore stood and watched and felt for the first time in a very long time the specific and unfamiliar sensation of having miscalculated badly. She let the curtain fall. She turned away from the window. Her hands, for the first time in years, were not entirely steady. The written confirmation from Gerald Holt's office arrived 4 days after Christmas. It came in an official envelope with the territorial seal. And it was everything Evelyn had asked for, signed dated the claim cleared permanently. Language that left no room for any future challenges on the same grounds. She read it standing at her kitchen counter in the early morning, still in her coat from the walk to the post office, the starter jar breathing quietly on the shelf beside her. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original crease and set it on the table and made coffee. She was not celebrating, not yet. She understood enough about how men like Robert Whitmore operated to know that a setback was not a retreat. He had tried one avenue and found it blocked, which meant he would look for another, and the next one might not come with advance notice and official paperwork. The next one might come sideways in the dark, in the form of something she couldn't document and couldn't argue against in a registry office. She thought about that while the coffee heated. She thought about what her mother would say. Ruth Carter had been a woman who believed in preparing for what you could see coming and trusting yourself to handle what you couldn't. She had also believed in the specific power of doing things in public in front of witnesses, because a thing that happened in front of witnesses had a different weight than a thing that happened in private. A thing in front of witnesses became real in a way that private things, however true, could never quite achieve. Evelyn picked up the confirmation letter. She put it in her coat pocket. And then she went to find Cole Walker. He was at his south pasture fence line when she rode up his back to her, working a post with focused efficiency, the kind of work a man does when his hands know what they're doing, well enough that his mind can be somewhere else. He heard the horse and turned, and when he saw her, he set the post driver down and walked over without being asked, which was simply how he was. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. He looked up. "Clean," he said. "Completely," she said. He handed it back. "Robert Whitmore is going to be unhappy about this." "I expect so," she said. "Cole, I've been thinking about what comes next." "So have I," he said. "I don't think we should wait for it." She held his eyes. "He's used the registry, the social pressure, the church channels, the feed store business. He's tried to isolate me legally and socially, and he's failed at both. What does a man like that do when the small moves don't work?" Cole was quiet for a moment. He picked up his work gloves from the fence post and turned them in his hands. "He goes after something that matters," he said. "Not to you, to me." "The ranch," she said. "Or Jamie," he said. And his voice went to a different register entirely. Not louder, not harder, but deeper. The way a sound goes when it comes from somewhere fundamental. If he can find a way to suggest I'm being reckless with my son's welfare, by choosing you, by bringing you into his life, who would he take that to? "The county family court sits in Helena," Cole said. "It's rarely invoked, but it exists. A man with Robert Whitmore's connections and Robert Whitmore's money can put pressure on a judge to at least look at a petition." His jaw tightened. "It would go nowhere. I know that. But the damage wouldn't be in the outcome, it would be in the process. It would be in people hearing that there was a question raised about my fitness as a father." Evelyn felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. "That's what he's building toward," she said. "I think so," Cole said. "Yes?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then we need to move first." He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that the most effective thing we can do is make what he's trying to destroy into something he can't touch. Make it public. Make it witnessed. Make it so established and so clearly supported by people in this community that any attempt to paint it as reckless or improper looks exactly like what it is: a man using the courts to settle a personal score against people who refuse to arrange themselves according to his wife's preferences." Cole was very still. "You're talking about a public courtship," he said. "I'm talking about the truth," she said. "In public, in front of witnesses." He looked at her for a long moment, with that particular quality of attention she had come to understand meant he was thinking through something all the way to its edges, not skipping any of the hard parts. "You understand what that means," he said. "What I'm asking you to take on, this town, these people. It won't be comfortable, Evelyn. Not for a while. Maybe not for a long while." "Cole," she said, "I have been uncomfortable in this town since I arrived. The difference is that now I would be uncomfortable next to somebody instead of alone." She held his gaze. "That is a substantial difference." His expression did something complicated, and he looked away for a moment out at the pasture, and she let him have that moment without filling it. And then he looked back. "Evelyn Carter," he said, "will you do me the honor of letting me court you properly? Openly. Dinners at the hotel and church on Sunday. And whatever else this town needs to see to understand that this is real and that I am not apologizing for it." "Yes," she said. "On one condition." "Name it." "You stop questioning the fence post spacing." A beat of silence. "The spacing is fine," he said. "Cole. It's within acceptable." "I brought a measuring line," she said, and pulled it from her coat pocket, and the expression on his face when he looked at it, a mixture of exasperation and helpless amusement, was one of the finest things she had seen in years. They did it exactly as she'd said, publicly, without apology. The first Sunday, they attended church together, Evelyn and Cole and Jamie sitting three abreast in the fourth pew from the front, which was not the back where she had been quietly relegated, and was not the prominent front where the Whitmores sat, but was the solid middle. The kind of pew that says, "We are here, and we are staying, and we are not performing anything, just occupying space that is ours." The silence when they walked in lasted approximately 10 seconds. Then the Reverend began the service, as if nothing unusual had happened, because he was a man who understood that the best thing to do in some moments was simply to proceed. Jamie sat between them. He shared a hymnal with Evelyn because he couldn't see all the words from his angle, and she held one side and he held the other. And partway through the third verse, he leaned against her arm slightly, not consciously, just the small, unconscious lean of a child who has decided someone is safe. And Evelyn felt it happen and kept her eyes on the hymnal and breathed through it very carefully. After the service, people spoke to them. Not all the people, but more than she had expected. Men who came up to Cole and shook his hand and looked at Evelyn and nodded with the particular nod of people who are choosing a side and are comfortable with their choice. Women who were careful but genuine, who said, "Miss Carter," with warmth, who bent down and spoke to Jamie with the ease of people who had children of their own and understood the specific significance of a small boy who attended church with his father and held a hymnal with a woman who wasn't his mother. Margaret Whitmore left without speaking to either of them. She left with her back very straight and her husband's hand on her arm and the expression of a woman who is rewriting her strategy in real time. Robert Whitmore. Evelyn noticed, did not leave immediately. He stood near the door for a moment and looked at Cole, and Cole looked back at him, and something passed between them that was not warm, that was not a threat exactly, but that was an acknowledgement. Two men who understood each other's positions completely and were done pretending otherwise. Robert Whitmore left. Cole turned back to Evelyn and said, "Sunday dinner at the hotel." "Jamie can come," she said. "Jamie always comes," he said. Jamie, who was listening, "I want the roast." "You can have the roast," Cole said. They had the roast. All three of them at a table by the window in the Willow Creek Hotel dining room in full view of the street and anyone who walked past it, and the waiter brought Jamie an extra roll without being asked, because Jamie had looked at the breadbasket with an expression of transparent longing that was apparently visible from across the room. And Evelyn watched Cole's son eat his Sunday roast and talk with grave seriousness about the differences between the various horses on the Walker Ranch, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for so long she'd almost forgotten it had ever been anything else. She was almost peaceful. And then, 2 weeks into January, everything she had built collapsed in a single night. The storm came from the north, the way the worst ones always did, without the gradual warning signs she had learned to read over 6 years of Montana winters. She went to bed on a Thursday with a cold sky and reasonable wind, and woke at 2 in the morning to a sound like the world coming apart. She was on her feet before she fully understood she was awake. She went to the window and couldn't see anything, just white, solid, white, moving white, the kind of blizzard that doesn't just cover things, but erases them entirely. She pulled on every layer she owned and went to check the animals, which she managed barely by feel and memory, and the rope she'd strung between the house and the barn the first year she was here precisely for nights like this. She got the animals through. She got herself back to the house. She didn't get the kitchen. The weight of snow on the old roof section over the kitchen addition was more than the beams had been built for. She would know that afterward would be able to look at the split beam and understand exactly what had failed and why. But in the moment, what she heard was a crack that she felt in her teeth, and then the sound of something giving, and then cold and white pouring in from above like the sky itself had decided to come inside. She got out. She was not hurt. She stood in the main part of the house, which held, and listened to the kitchen collapse behind the connecting door, and felt the cold coming through every gap like something with intent. She sat on the floor of her front room for a while. Just sat there. She was not crying. She was doing the accounting that needed to be done. The kitchen was gone. The oven was gone. Her baking tools, the ones that had been her mother's, the tin measuring cup with the dent, the long-handled wooden spoon worn smooth from 30 years of use, the scoring knife her mother had sharpened so many times. The blade was narrow and bright, all of it under the collapsed roof and 3 feet of snow. The clay jar, the starter. She was on her feet before she finished the thought. She got to the connecting door and opened it, and the cold hit her like a wall, and she looked at what had been her kitchen. The shelf was down. Everything on it was down. The clay jar was somewhere under the beam, and the snow, and the pieces of old roof. She went in anyway. She dug. With her bare hands in the ruins of her kitchen in the middle of the night in a blizzard, she dug through cold and debris until her hands were bleeding from something she didn't see, and she was shaking so hard she could barely maintain her grip, and she found the jar. It was intact. It was cold, too cold, dangerously cold, but it was intact, not broken lid, still sealed. She held it against her chest with both arms, and walked back through the door and kicked it closed behind her, and sank down against the wall, and sat there with the jar pressed to her body, sharing her heat with it, just breathing. That was how the next hour went. Her, the jar, the cold, the sound of the storm. When the storm had quieted enough to make it possible, she wrapped herself in everything she had and walked to the nearest neighbor, the Harlow family, whose pipes she had brought food to 3 winters ago, and she knocked until Frank Harlow came to the door with a lamp, and she said, "My kitchen roof came down," and he said, "Get inside," and that was that. She did not send for coal. She did not send for coal because she was not in a position emotionally to see him yet. She was still in the part of the disaster where she needed to hold herself together from the inside, and she knew from experience that the presence of someone she cared about when she was this close to the edge would break the holding. Cole found out at 6 in the morning when Tom Briggs at the blacksmith mentioned it, and he arrived at the Harlow farm at 7 with Mrs. Pierce and a wagon, and Jamie and 3 hired hands, and the specific expression of a man who has been containing something with great effort for the duration of the ride over. She met him at the door. He looked at her hands bandaged. Now Mrs. Harlow had seen to that. And he looked at her face, and he did not ask if she was all right, because he could see that she was not, and they both knew that asking the question would require her to lie or to come apart, and he was not willing to make her do either. He said, "Tell me what you need." "The kitchen needs to be cleared," she said. "The beam needs to come out, and the roof needs to be assessed, and I need to know what's salvageable before I can figure out next steps." "All right," he said. "And I need someone to take the starter jar," she said. And her voice, to her own intense frustration, did an unsteady thing on the last 2 words, just slightly, just enough that he heard it. "I need it somewhere warm. It got too cold last night, and I've been trying to keep it warm. But I don't know if I managed to." "Mrs. Pierce," Cole said, turning to the woman beside him. "Can you take the jar back to the house and put it somewhere the temperature stays even?" Mrs. Pierce, who was the kind of woman who understood the weight of things without needing them, explained, held out her hands for the jar. Evelyn handed it over. She watched Mrs. Pierce take it with both hands, carefully the way you'd carry something that mattered. She breathed. "All right," Cole said to Evelyn quietly, just between them. "Now tell me what you actually need." "You actually." She looked at him. Her hands were throbbing, and she hadn't slept, and the kitchen her mother had existed in through every recipe Evelyn had ever made was under 3 feet of snow and a collapsed beam, and she was so tired she could feel it behind her eyes, and she said, "I need 5 minutes." "Take them," he said. She went back inside to the small room Mrs. Harlow had given her, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she pressed her bandaged hands flat on her knees, and she breathed for 5 minutes. Exactly 5. And she did not cry, because she was choosing not to, because she needed the energy for what came next. And grief would wait. Grief always waited. It was one of the things grief was reliable about. She went back out. "Let's go," she said. The cleanup took 3 days. Cole's hands cleared the debris. His carpenter, a man named Seth, who had been with the Walker operation for 7 years, assessed the structure and told them the main house was sound. The failure had been entirely in the added kitchen section, which had been built by the previous owner with green lumber and wishful thinking. The news was that it could be rebuilt. The harder news was that it would take time, materials, and money that Evelyn had in partial but not complete supply. She made the calculation. She sat down with her ledger and her pencil, and she went through it carefully. She had savings. Not enough. She had credit at the mercantile. Limited. She had the homestead itself clear title now, which was collateral for a banknote if she could get one, and getting one would require dealing with whoever sat behind the loan desk at the Willow Creek Savings Association, which was an institution that had never once in its history issued a note to a single woman without a male guarantor. She knew this. She went anyway. The man at the desk was named Herbert Crane. He was not a cruel man. He was the kind of man who enforces systems without particularly believing in them, which is a different kind of problem than cruelty, because it's much harder to argue with. He looked at her application. He looked at her title confirmation. He said, "Miss Carter, I'm afraid our lending standards for unsecured personal property notes require a co-signer for applicants without—" "With respect, Mr. Crane," she said, "my title is clear and recorded. My property is producing, and my payment history with every creditor in this county is perfect. Tell me which specific lending standard I fail to meet." He looked at the application again. He cleared his throat. The co-signer requirement for single female applicants is what precisely? Is it written into your charter? Is it territorial law? Is it recorded policy? Or is it simply the way things have been done?" Silence. "Because if it is simply the way things have been done," she said, "I would like to discuss the way things could be done instead." Herbert Crane looked like a man who had not been spoken to this way before, and who was not entirely certain he disliked it. He looked at the application for a long moment. Cole Walker walked through the bank door. Evelyn had not told him she was coming here. She turned and looked at him. He looked at her, and then at the desk, and then at Herbert Crane, and he walked over and stood beside Evelyn at the counter and said simply, "Herbert." Herbert Crane said, "Mr. Walker." "I'm here to co-sign Miss Carter's loan application," Cole said, "if she'll permit it." Evelyn turned to look at him. "I didn't ask you to come here." "No," he said. "I didn't tell you I was coming here." "No," he said. "But I know you, and I knew you were going to do this today, and I knew you were going to try to do it alone, and I'm not going to let you do that." He held her eyes. "Not because you can't, you clearly can, but because you shouldn't have to. Because I am here, and I am choosing to be here, and we are past the part of this where you refuse help because you've spent 6 years doing everything alone, and it's become a habit." He paused. "Let me stand here. That's all I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to be insufferable about this," she said. "Probably," he said. "If I allow this." "You're not allowing it. I'm offering it. There's a difference." "There is not that much difference." "Evelyn." She looked at Herbert Crane, who was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who has just realized he is witnessing something that has nothing to do with him and is choosing to be very quiet about it. "Fine," she said. Cole co-signed the application. Herbert Crane processed it with an efficiency that had not been visible in the earlier conversation. They walked out together into the January cold. "You followed me," she said. "I came to town for feed," he said. "Then I saw your horse outside the bank." She looked at him sideways. "You came to town for feed?" "Yes." "In January." "Ranches need feed in January." She stopped walking. He stopped too. They stood on the street. "Cole," she said, "I need to say something to you." "All right," he said. She looked at her bandaged hands for a moment. Then at him. "I have been managing my life on my own for 6 years. Before that, I managed it alongside my mother, and before she got sick, alongside my father. I have never in my adult life had someone who showed up. Not for the festivals, and not for the disasters. Not without me having to specifically arrange for it." She stopped, took a breath. "I don't entirely know how to do this. I'm going to do it wrong sometimes. I'm going to refuse help I should accept, and accept help I should figure out myself, and I'm going to be stubborn about things that don't deserve stubbornness, and you're going to want to ride away and not come back." Cole waited until she was finished. "I know," he said. "You know. I've known since the second Thursday," he said. "Since you told me I was wrong about the drainage and then proved it with math." He looked at her with complete steadiness. "Evelyn, I'm not looking for someone who doesn't have edges. I'm not looking for someone who needs me in order to function. I had that and I loved her and I won't pretend otherwise. But what I need, what Jamie needs, is someone who chooses to let us in. Not because she has to, because she wants to." He paused. "Do you want to?" She looked at him. All 6 years of Montana mornings. The clay jar, the collapsed kitchen, the coins on the table, the alley in November, his hand in hers in December, his son's ear pressed against the oven listening to bread grow. "Yes," she said. "I want to." He reached out and took her bandaged hand very carefully, so he wasn't pressing on anything that hurt. "Then we'll figure out the rest," he said. They were still standing there when Margaret Whitmore came around the corner from the mercantile. She stopped. For a moment, just a moment, the three of them occupied the same stretch of street, and nobody moved. Then, Margaret Whitmore did something that nobody, including Evelyn, was expecting. She looked at Evelyn's bandaged hands. She looked at Cole's hand around them. She looked at Evelyn's face, which was tired and honest, and not performing anything, which was simply the face of a woman who had been through something hard and was standing on the other side of it with someone beside her. Something moved across Margaret Whitmore's face. Something complicated and private that Evelyn could not fully read because it was the kind of expression that belonged to a person's interior and not their social surface. And seeing it on Margaret's face was so disorienting that for a second, Evelyn didn't recognize it. It was something like recognition, like seeing something she'd been arguing against for months, and suddenly in this particular light on this particular morning, being unable to maintain the argument. She did not speak to them. She walked past. But she did not look away first. Evelyn watched her go. "What was that?" she said quietly. "That," Cole said equally quiet, "is a woman who just ran out of reasons." Evelyn looked at where Margaret Whitmore had been, and then back at Cole, and something told her the same instinct that told her when the bread was right, when the dough had reached the moment it needed, when the thing she'd been tending had become what it was always trying to become. Something told her that the worst of it was over. Not that the road from here was simple. Not that people changed all at once, or that the weight of 6 years of smallness lifted in a single winter morning. But that the thing Margaret Whitmore had built was made of other people's agreement. And agreement, once it started shifting, shifted the way ground shifts in spring, not all at once, but continuously, and with a kind of inevitability that nothing constructed on top of it could hold against. She looked at her bandaged hands in Cole's careful grip. "The kitchen's going to take at least 6 weeks to rebuild," she said. "Seth thinks 4. Cole said, if the weather cooperates. Seth is optimistic. Seth is good at his work. I'll believe it when I see the roof go up," she said. "You'll be there when it goes up," he said. "You'll probably be telling Seth what he's doing wrong. If he's doing something wrong, someone should tell him." "Evelyn." "Cole." He squeezed her hand very gently around the bandages. She squeezed back. Seth finished the kitchen roof in 5 weeks and 2 days. Evelyn did not tell Cole she had been counting. She also did not tell Seth that he'd beaten her estimate because Seth already had a confidence level that was perfectly calibrated and did not need her help adjusting it upward. She simply stood in the finished kitchen on a Thursday morning in late February, looked at the new beam running clean and solid across the ceiling, looked at the shelves rebuilt in the same position as the old ones, looked at the oven that Cole had sourced from a supplier in Helena and had transported by wagon through 20 miles of winter road, and she breathed it in. The clay jar was back on its shelf. Mrs. Pierce had kept the starter alive through the 6 weeks of displacement with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, feeding it on schedule, keeping it at the right temperature, treating it like exactly what it was, something irreplaceable that someone was trusting her with. When she handed it back to Evelyn, she said, "It's been a good guest." And Evelyn said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pierce," and meant it in a way that those 3 words were not really sufficient to carry. Cole was there when she made the first loaf in the new kitchen. Jamie was there too, on his chair watching the starter go into the dough with the focused attention of a child who has decided this is important, and therefore treats it as sacred. Cole was at the table with coffee, not talking much, just present in the particular way he was present, solid, unhurried, not demanding anything from the room, just occupying it. When the bread came out, Jamie said, "It smells the same." "It's the same bread," Evelyn said, "but the kitchen is different." "The bread doesn't care about the kitchen," she said. "The bread cares about the hands." Jamie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "And the starter." "And the starter," she agreed. Cole was watching her from the table. She glanced at him, and the expression on his face was the open one, the one she had learned to recognize and had stopped trying to protect herself from, because there was no protection from it. It simply went through whatever she put up clean and direct the way truth does. She set the bread on the table. The three of them sat and ate it, and it was exactly the same as it had always been, and that was its own kind of miracle, that through the storm and the collapse and the 6 weeks of displacement and everything that had been broken and rebuilt, the bread came back exactly itself, without loss, without diminishment. "Still the best bread in Montana," Jamie said, which was something he had apparently decided was his line now, and delivered with the confidence of a 7-year-old who has staked a claim. "You've had bread in other places," Cole said. "Helena, Butte." "It wasn't as good," Jamie said simply, as if this settled the matter, which it did. Evelyn looked at this boy, this serious, particular, remarkable boy, who said goodnight to horses, and believed bread could talk, and had decided months ago without fanfare or announcement that she was someone worth showing up for. And she felt something in her chest so warm and specific that she had to look back at her plate for a moment to collect herself. She collected herself. Then she said, "Jamie, I need to ask you something." He looked up from his bread. "Okay, I want to ask you," she said carefully, "how you would feel if I were around more, not just Thursdays, more than that." Jamie looked at her, then at his father, then back at her. His expression was thoughtful in the complete, unhurried way of a child who is actually considering a question rather than reaching for the nearest acceptable answer. "Like at the ranch," he said. "Possibly," she said. "Or in other ways. I want to know how you feel about it. Your feelings are the ones that matter most to me in this particular question." Jamie put his piece of bread down. He folded his hands on the table, which was a gesture so purely Cole that Evelyn had to look at the shelf for a second. "Miss Carter," he said, "I already think of Thursdays as yours." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "In the week," he said patiently, like she might just need more explanation. "Monday is school. Tuesday is barn chores. Wednesday is when Mrs. Pierce makes soup. Thursday is yours." He looked at her matter-of-factly. "It's already yours. You could just have more days." Evelyn Carter pressed her lips together very carefully and looked at the clay jar on the shelf and was entirely still for about 4 seconds. "Thank you, Jamie," she said. Her voice was even. She was a woman who had survived 6 Montana winters alone, and she was not going to come apart because a 7-year-old had just handed her the most generous thing anyone had said to her in years. She looked at Cole. He was looking at his coffee cup. His jaw was working slightly the way it did when he was containing something. "Your fence post spacing is still wrong," she told him. He looked up. "It is not. I measured it. You measure everything. That's how you know when things are right," she said. "Some of us measure." The corner of his mouth pulled up. "Some of us," he agreed. They did not discuss it more that day. But something had been said, and it was the kind of thing that once said could not go back to being unsaid, and they both understood that, and they let it sit between them like the bread cooling on the board, patient, present, ready. The proposal, when it came in March. Not in a grand setting. Not at the hotel or the church or any of the public places they had been strategically, carefully visible in over the past months. It came on a Tuesday morning at her kitchen table, which meant Cole had come out without Jamie, which itself told her something before a single word was spoken. He came in and she gave him coffee, and he sat down and she sat across from him, and he turned the cup in his hands twice, and then looked at her with the expression he wore when he had finished thinking something all the way through and had arrived at the only reasonable conclusion. "Evelyn," he said. "Cole," she said. "I'm going to say something." "I expect so," she said. "You generally do when you've taken that much time getting to it." He set the cup down. "I want to marry you. I have wanted to for a while. I've been trying to give you enough time to want it too, or to tell me clearly that you don't, and I think I've waited about as long as is sensible, and I need to know where you stand." She looked at him. "I also want to say," he continued, "because I know how your mind works, and I know what you're about to consider. I want to say that this is not about the barn roof or the banknote or any of the practical things I've been involved in over the past few months. Those things needed doing, and I was glad to do them, but they are not the reason. The reason is that I want to be in a house where you are. I want Jamie to grow up knowing you're permanent. I want to sit at this table and argue about fence spacing until we're both old, and I want to still be arguing about it, and both of us to still be right in our respective ways." He held her eyes. "That's the reason." Evelyn was quiet. She thought about what it meant to say yes to this. Not the practical version. The practical version she could inventory in her sleep, and it was good. It was solid. The arithmetic of their lives joining together made obvious and clear sense on every front. She thought about the other version, the weight of it, the permanence, the act of deciding that the thing she had protected most carefully, her own self-sufficiency, the careful walls she had built, not out of coldness, but out of necessity, the discipline of not needing the act of deciding to set that down, voluntarily, in front of another person. She thought about Thursday being hers. She thought about Jamie folding his hands on the table and looking at her with his father's eyes and saying it like it was obvious. "You could just have more days." She thought about her mother's bread in a rebuilt kitchen on a new shelf, exactly the same as it had always been. She thought about the clay jar that had traveled from Missouri to Montana and survived a collapsed roof and 6 weeks in someone else's kitchen and came back unchanged, still alive, still capable of making the thing it had always been capable of making. She thought some things survive everything you put them through and come back exactly themselves. She thought to be one of those things. "Yes," she said. Cole was very still. "Yes," she said again more firmly, like she was staking a post. "I want to marry you. I have wanted to for longer than I'm going to admit to your face right now. And I'll tell Jamie he can have every day, not just Thursdays." Cole stood up from the table. He came around to her side and she stood up and he put both hands on her face. The big, careful, work-roughened hands of a man who had spent his life handling things he wanted to keep safe, and he looked at her for a moment before he did anything else, like he needed to see her clearly first. "Evelyn Carter," he said. "Cole Walker," she said. He kissed her. Quiet and certain. The way everything about him was certain, and she put her hands flat against his chest and kissed him back. And outside the February-ending March, beginning sky was doing something pale and promising, and neither of them paid attention to it, because there was nothing out there that required their attention right now. They told Jamie that evening. He listened to the whole thing very carefully, which he always did, and then he said, "So, you're going to be my mother." The word landed in the room with a specific weight that neither of the adults had quite prepared for. Evelyn looked at him. "I would like to be the person who is there for you," she said. "What you call me is up to you. It's always going to be up to you." Jamie thought about it. "My friend Thomas has a stepmother," he said. "He calls her by her name." "That's one way," Evelyn said. "My friend Clara has a stepmother she calls Mama," he said, "because that's what felt right." "That's another way." He was quiet for a moment, turning this over with the thoroughness he brought to everything that mattered to him. "Can I decide later?" he said. "You can decide whenever you're ready," she said. "Or never decide and just see what comes out naturally. That works too." He nodded, satisfied. Then he looked at his father. "Can she teach me the scoring for the bread when it's my birthday bread?" Cole looked at Evelyn. Absolutely, she said. Jamie nodded again, fully resolved. Okay, he said. Good. That was that. The wedding was set for June, and in the weeks between the yes and the June morning, when they stood in front of the Reverend in the same hall where her bread had once been mocked, 3 things happened that Willow Creek did not expect, and that changed the temperature of the town in ways that those who tried to predict such things had not predicted. The first was Robert Whitmore. In early April, a man arrived from Helena, a territorial auditor, quiet and methodical, who spent 2 weeks reviewing the financial records of the Willow Creek Savings Association and several associated business arrangements. The review was not initiated by Cole, not initiated by Evelyn, not connected in any direct way to the Whitmore campaign against them. It was the result of a complaint filed the previous autumn by a farmer named Ed Greer, whose land Whitmore had acquired through a foreclosure that Greer had always claimed was manipulated. The auditor was thorough. What he found in Robert Whitmore's financial dealings was a pattern that had nothing to do with Evelyn Carter, and everything to do with a decade of careful manipulation, inflated interest calculations, foreclosures, triggered on technicalities that should never have cleared legal review, loan terms that had been verbally modified from their written versions in ways that consistently favored the Whitmore grain operation. The auditor filed his report. The territorial attorney's office opened an investigation. Robert Whitmore, on a Tuesday in mid-April, was asked to appear before a territorial hearing in Helena. Cole told Evelyn at her kitchen table the morning after he heard. He told it flatly, without triumph, because he was not a man who found satisfaction in other people's ruin, even the ruin of people who had tried to ruin them. Evelyn sat with it for a moment. Ed Greer filed that complaint last autumn, she said. Before any of this started, Cole confirmed. Whitmore didn't come after us because we were a threat. He came after us because he was already afraid, and afraid men lash out at whatever's closest. He paused. We were just the visible target. She thought about that. Does Margaret know? She knows, he said. She's known for longer than he has, I'd imagine. Evelyn looked at the jar on the shelf. She's going to need people to be decent to her, she said slowly. Whatever he did, she didn't file the false claims. Cole looked at her for a long moment. You're thinking about being decent to Margaret Whitmore. I'm thinking, she said carefully, that a woman whose husband has just had his entire financial history opened up for public review is going to find out very quickly who in this town was friendly with her because they liked her, and who was friendly with her because they were afraid of him. And I think that is going to be a hard thing to discover. She met his eyes. I'm not saying what she did was right. It wasn't. I'm saying I know what it feels like to be in a room where nobody is choosing to be kind. Cole looked at her for a long time. I will never, he said, in whatever years I have left, stop being astonished by you. That's not astonishment, she said. That's just decency. On you, he said. They look the same. The second thing that happened was the bread. It started because of Jamie. He had, in the months of Evelyn's increased presence at the ranch, and then her official status as the woman his father was going to marry, become a dedicated student of the sourdough process. Not just an observer, but a participant, showing up for every stage with his folded hands and his serious face, and his series of questions that were sometimes obvious and sometimes so precise they startled her. He told his friend Thomas about the bread. Thomas told his mother, who told her sister, who told her husband, who told 3 people at the feed store. The feed store conversation was overheard by a woman from a ranch 12 miles east, who had a standing order with a bakery in Helena that had recently closed. By April, Evelyn had 6 requests for regular loaves. She did not have time for 6 regular loaves between the farm and the wedding preparations, and the increasingly complex logistics of 2 households that were in the process of becoming one. She told Cole this. He told her to think about what she actually wanted, not what was manageable under current circumstances. She told him that was an impractical distinction. He said it wasn't. They disagreed about it for 2 days, which was shorter than their disagreements usually ran. Then she sat down with her ledger. She did the arithmetic. She looked at the arithmetic for a long time. Then she went out to the barn where Cole was checking a horse's left foreleg, and she said, "If I had a proper commercial oven and a dedicated baking space, I could do 20 loaves a week without it affecting the farm work." Cole straightened up. "And 20 loaves a week," she said. "At the price I'm being asked to charge is more than the farm clears in a good month." He looked at her. "I'm not saying this because of the money," she said. "I'm saying it because it's my mother's recipe, and it has been alive in that jar for 33 years, and I think it deserves to be in the world in a real way, in a way that goes beyond Thursdays." She paused. "I think it deserves to be known." "Then let's build you a proper kitchen," he said. "It's a significant expense." "The Walker Ranch has had a significant year," he said. "The cattle market was good. We can do this." He looked at her. "And I want to be clear, this isn't me funding your project. This is me investing in something that belongs to both of us now." She looked at him steadily. "That's a fine distinction." "It's an important one," he said. "Say yes." "I'm going to say yes," she said. "I'm just making a note that you're very difficult." "Noted," he said. The third thing. The thing nobody in Willow Creek saw coming, including Evelyn, happened on a Wednesday in May, 3 weeks before the wedding. Margaret Whitmore came to her door, alone. No calling card sent ahead, no message, no preparation. Just a knock at the door, and Margaret on the other side of it, and it was the first time Evelyn had seen her up close since the December street, and she looked different. Not diminished. Margaret Whitmore did not do diminished, but altered. Like something had shifted behind the precise arrangements of her appearance and was showing through in the set of her jaw and the quality of the stillness she held. She looked tired. She looked real. "Miss Carter," she said. Evelyn looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I come in?" The question was direct and without the social filigree that had always armored Margaret's speech before no performance of whether she was expected, no gracious management of the awkwardness. Just a question asked plainly by a woman who apparently no longer had the energy for the alternative. Evelyn stepped back from the door. Margaret came in. She looked at the kitchen, the new beam, the rebuilt shelves, the oven. She looked at the clay jar. She looked at the table. She sat down when Evelyn indicated the chair, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight out of what was clearly lifelong habit, rather than current intention. Evelyn made coffee. She brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from Margaret Whitmore in the kitchen that had been rebuilt after a winter collapse at the table where Cole Walker had first sat in October, and she waited. Margaret looked at her coffee. She didn't pick it up. "I came to tell you something," she said. "All right," Evelyn said. "I came to tell you." She stopped. Something moved in her face. Something that was not pleasant, but that was genuine. "What I said about you, what I allowed to be said, at the festival and after it, and in the store that day, I know you heard what Ada said. I could see you at the counter, and I didn't." She stopped again, took a breath. "I didn't correct her. I should have. I didn't." Evelyn was quiet. "I have spent 30 years in this town, being certain I knew who belonged where," Margaret said. "I arranged things. I understood the arrangements. I was good at it, and I believed the arrangements were right, and She looked at the table. "Robert's business dealings were never, I didn't know the extent of them. I want you to know that. I'm not saying it to excuse myself. I'm saying it because it's true, and because the truth seems to be the appropriate currency right now given everything." She paused. "But I knew enough. I knew he pressed on things. I knew he used what he had. And I let him because it was convenient, because it kept the arrangements intact." She looked up at Evelyn. "I used his methods with you, not his financial methods, but the same instinct. Press on the thing until it moves. And you didn't move." "No," Evelyn said, "I didn't. You should know. Margaret said that I have been wrong about you since the day you arrived in this town. Entirely wrong. About your character and your capability and your worth." She said it flatly without softening it, because she was apparently done with softening things. "And I am telling you this because you deserve to hear it said plainly, and because I am tired of not being honest, and because in approximately 3 weeks, you are going to marry Cole Walker and become a permanent resident of the position in this community that I spent considerable energy trying to deny you, and you deserve to hear it before that happens." She picked up her coffee. "From me, directly." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. She thought about everything Margaret Whitmore had cost her: the social isolation, the land challenge, the whispers, the feed store, the Sunday pew, all of it. She thought about the specific and long-burning coldness of being small in a room full of people who had decided you should be small. She thought about what she'd told Cole. "I know what it feels like to be in a room where nobody is choosing to be kind." She thought about the clay jar, still alive after everything. "Thank you," she said, "for coming here." Margaret looked at her. "You don't have to forgive me." "I know," Evelyn said, "but I'm not interested in carrying it. I have too many other things to carry." She looked at this woman across her kitchen table. This complicated, difficult, real woman who had done real damage and was sitting here with her real face showing for what was possibly the first time in years, and she said, "What you did to me was wrong. I want you to know I know that, and I'm not pretending it wasn't. But you came here, and you said it plainly, and I respect that it cost you something. So we can start from here." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "From here," she said. "From here," Evelyn said. Margaret drank her coffee. It was not warm between them. It was not comfortable. It was two women at a table with a real and complicated history between them, choosing to let that history be what it was without letting it be everything. It was in its way the most honest conversation Evelyn had ever had in this town. When Margaret left, she stopped at the door and looked at the kitchen once more. "Your bread," she said. "At the festival. It was the best thing on that table." She did not look away when she said it. "I knew it when I tasted it. I said what I said anyway. I want you to know that too." Evelyn held the door. "I know," she said. "I knew you knew." Margaret looked at her. Something in her face that might, in a different woman in a different moment, have been the beginning of a rueful smile. She left. Evelyn stood at the closed door for a long moment. Then she went to the shelf and looked at the clay jar. She pressed her palm flat against its side, the familiar shape of it, the particular ceramic cool of it. "Did you hear that, Mama?" she said quietly. She fed the starter. The wedding was on a Saturday in June the 14th, which was the date Cole had let Jamie choose, because Jamie had been asked which Saturday felt best, and had thought about it with his characteristic thoroughness for 3 minutes, and then said the 14th, with complete conviction and no explanation, and that had been that. The hall was the same hall, the same wooden floor, the same windows throwing the same thin light, the same general smell of old timber and polish, and too many people in a room that had been closed for winter. The tables along the back wall were loaded with food. From half the town people had brought things, more people than Evelyn had expected, people who had been less vocal, and were now choosing to let the volume come up. On the center table, surrounded by everything else, were 20 loaves of Evelyn's bread. Warm, dark, thick-crusted, imperfect in the particular way of things that have been made by hand with attention and care and time. No decoration, no glaze, no performance. Just bread that had earned its place on the table. Jamie stood beside his father at the front of the hall, in a dark jacket that was slightly too large, and that he wore with complete dignity. And when Evelyn walked to the front, he looked at her with Cole's eyes in his smaller face, and he gave her one slow, serious nod. The nod of a person confirming that something that should be happening is happening. She nodded back. The Reverend spoke. Cole held her hands, her calloused, capable, fully healed hands, and looked at her with the absolute settled certainty of a man who has thought every inch of this through and has no remaining doubts. And he said the words he had prepared in the tone of a man who means each one of them precisely. And she said hers back the same way. When it was done, the room made a sound that rooms make when something real has happened in them. They ate. They danced, some of them. The bread disappeared faster than anything else on the table, and more than one person sought Evelyn out specifically to tell her so, and a woman from the East Valley introduced herself and asked if there was any way to arrange a regular order, and Evelyn told her to come find her next week and they'd work it out. Cole was beside her for most of the evening, and when he wasn't beside her, he was visible across the room with Jamie on his shoulders because Jamie had gotten tired and stopped protesting things. His hands wrapped around his son's ankles to keep him steady, talking to Tom Briggs from the blacksmith with his easy, unhurried manner. She watched him. She had watched him all year in her kitchen, at her table, in alleys and bank offices and December streets. And she had learned him, the way she learned things she planned to keep, which was completely. And she knew now the specific quality of his patience, and the exact temperature of his anger, and the particular way his face opened when Jamie said something that surprised him. And she knew the look he got when he was about to be wrong about something, and knew it. And she knew the sound of his voice at 6 in the morning when he was still mostly asleep, and she had become somehow part of the house he woke up in. She knew that she was loved. Not because he had said it, though he had said it plainly, and without ceremony, in the way he said everything that mattered, but because she had watched him demonstrate it in the daily, undramatic, specific language of a man who showed up, who rode to her gate, and sat at her table, and stood beside her in the cold, and held her bandaged hands, and co-signed her banknote, and built her an oven, and let his son tell her she could have more days. She had spent 6 years in this town, being taught that she was less. She was standing in this hall, in the same hall where they had laughed at her bread, and she was surrounded by people who had chosen to be there. And her husband was across the room with their son on his shoulders, and on the center table, the loaves her mother had taught her to make were gone. Every one of them eaten by the town that had once decided they weren't worth tasting. Jamie saw her from across the room. He lifted one hand from his father's head and waved. A small, certain wave. She waved back. Cole looked up at his son, then followed the direction of the wave and found her across the room. He held her eyes. She held his. Some things survive everything you put them through and come back exactly themselves. And some things, the things worth keeping, the things you tend and protect and refuse to let die through every cold morning and every collapsed roof and every room full of people who have decided you don't belong. Some things don't just survive. They rise.